Good evening, good morning. I don't know where you are, so have a nice day. This is Stefano Mazarin, Geopolitics from Italy. Today we have a special guest from United Kingdom, the retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, that will have an interesting speech about the actual war. So just to start at the beginning, to don't lose time, please make any question in the comments of the chat. If you will see the video after, put the question in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and make a like to the video so we can provide as more as possible good contents for you. So, Sean, if you want to present yourself to the people, I will start your session.
Stefano, thank you very much, and good day to everybody. Thank you very much for having me. If you pop up the first slide, Stefano, that would be great. By way of background, I'm not a specialist on Ukraine. I have a long career, had a long career in the Royal Air Force, and spent a lot of time on operations. My predecessors were in the Cold War. They didn't ever have to fight actual battles, whereas my period of time, we were involved in Kosovo, Sarajevo, invasion of Iraq, and I did 3 tours in Afghanistan as well. So although, and I've seen wars are started by politicians, but and ended normally by politicians, but it's the military who end up fighting the battles. And as a result, the military end up studying a lot of history to learn the lessons of history. And I have, with the Ukraine conflict, the serving military in the UK is not allowed to comment on the war. But I am a talking head. I'm kept briefed by the Ministry of Defence, amongst other areas, to provide the media with at least a little bit of a background to the conflict. None of us have a crystal ball at all, and I'm certainly not the expert at Ukraine. What I hope to do today, though, is to provide a quick canter over the conflict on the basis that was it inevitable that this would happen? But I see the great value in really the question and answer period. So next slide, please. In fact, I should be able to control that from here. There we go. The way I'd like to do that is to, we'll have a little bit of a look at the history, look at NATO expansion, and then what we think Putin's ambitions actually are. We'll look at any mistakes that I think he's made in big handfuls. I'm going to then canter just briefly over the nuclear dimension of this, and also a bit of next steps before then having a look at a question and answer time. I make no apologies for the fact that you can't cover this topic in 20 minutes. So I will leave a lot of questions unanswered, and hopefully that will add as the catalyst for the questions afterwards. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, in fact, there we go. I can do it. Right. So was the war inevitable? Well, nothing is inevitable, but throughout history, nations have fought over territory and resources. And let's put this into context. Over just 100 years ago, 1 in 4 people on this planet were part of the British Empire. And throughout history, there have been fights over borders and tensions. Now, over the last few years, particularly after the last 2 world wars, when a lot of countries' borders were rewritten, and with the advent of nuclear weapons, there's been a few less wars of national survival and more of wars of choice. But that doesn't mean that countries don't have tensions. China and Taiwan, Falkland Islands and Argentina, Gibraltar and Spain are just a few examples. And it really all depends about what time, when those lines are drawn on the map. And in deference to Stefano, you know, in British history, the Romans used to control the UK many hundreds of years ago. And therefore, if you go back far enough, Italy has a claim on the United Kingdom. So as ever with these things, it depends how you look through the lens of history. Now, if we look at Ukraine, if you look at the map that I've just shown you of 1900, the sort of Russian influence, Soviet Union influence extends right the way across the top of the Black Sea, completely envelops Ukraine and includes the island of Crimea and the port of Sevastopol. Crimea offers something Russia doesn't have, and that was really access to the sea, at least a sea that's not ice-locked down over to the west rather than to the east. And for much of Russia's history, it was landlocked. With 90% of the world's trade moving by sea, that left Russia as a potentially great nation feeling somewhat isolated. Sevastopol on Crimea offers a really good naval base. It's got a large, deep, defensible harbour. It's in the middle of the Black Sea, easy drop-off point, and it was founded as a naval base back in the 1700s. And I won't go through the whole of the history, but in World War II, Crimea became a real symbol of national survival for Russia. In 1941, the Nazis invaded the former Soviet Union, and the former Soviet Union was beaten time and time again. But in autumn, the Germans attacked Crimea, and Crimea held out for 9 months, resupplied by the sea. And Sevastopol, at the end of the Second World War, was awarded hero status as a city. Of course, World War II ends. Then in 1954, at the stroke of a pen, the then President Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine. Now, at the time, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, so it was nothing more than administratively handy. But of course, when the former Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia and Ukraine almost went to war over Crimea. Next slide, please. Let me do that. There we go. Now, at the time, the compromise was reached that Crimea remained part of Ukraine, but with an autonomous government on Crimea, and Sevastopol still in the hands with the Black Sea Fleet on a very long-term lease. Interestingly enough, at the same time, Ukraine, because it was the front line of the former Soviet Union at the time, was the third largest nuclear power in the world. Now, at the time, it didn't have the launch codes for those nuclear weapons, but there was a lot of discussion between Russia, America, and Ukraine. And eventually it was agreed that Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons in return for an absolute cast iron guarantee that the borders of Ukraine would be respected forever. And that led to the 1994 Budapest memo, which, of course, President Putin has just completely ignored since. Point being, though, that the port of Sevastopol and Crimea had been fought over for hundreds of years, were a symbol of Russian might, Russian trade, Russian prosperity, Russian greatness. And Russia did not want to lose Crimea. Next slide. At the time, let me click on that. Oh, go back. At the time, Russia was also reassured by America that NATO would not expand any further. And NATO is in blue here, the original founding members. But of course, as the years go by, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia joined NATO in 2004. At the time, after the fall of the Soviet Union, bluntly, Ukraine suffered a little bit. Its economy suffered. But eventually, it started looking to the West, the markets of the West, the European Union, for prosperity. At the same time, Putin observed that NATO was expanding eastward. And whilst I would argue that NATO is a defensive alliance, it does not swallow up countries. In reality, if you are in Russia, you see NATO expanding to your borders. Paranoid about the West's ambitions, paranoid about Ukraine becoming more and more democratic, vital to preserve the port of Sevastopol. In 2014, Putin moved to take Crimea, annex it off, and virtually bloodlessly, and see what the West would do. Well, of course, in big handfuls, the West did nothing. And within a few years, Russia was president of the UN Security Council again, and was being embraced by Western leaders. Meanwhile, though, Ukraine's prosperity was increasing, and by 2020, the Ukrainians had watched Russian annexation of Crimea, saw Russia as a threat, and started talking more openly about the security that NATO might bring. Well, of course, all that did was make Putin even more paranoid, and he hatched plans to secure the vital lands. Interestingly, by moving into Ukraine, he then also, the countries of Sweden and Finland, who up till now have been maintaining their neutrality, but Russian invasion of Ukraine exposed the vulnerabilities of that neutrality, and therefore they very swiftly moved to join NATO. So the irony here is that the very thing Russia was seeking to avoid then happened. So in terms of invasion, was it inevitable? Well, I in a way, I think it was. And I don't think anybody in the West could have predicted that Putin would have invaded Ukraine in the way he did. But I think that in a way it was inevitable. Look through Putin's lens. So we look at. I'm going to canter through a few more subjects, more for questions than anything else. So let's looking at what Putin's ambition is here. I think Putin is an interesting case study from a military perspective. There's no doubt that when the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian pride was massively dented. There was a lot of hardship withstood by the Slavs in Russia. So part of what Putin is trying to do is restore Russian pride, Russian greatness, but also his place in history. His office is surrounded by great statues of Peter the Great, for example. Part of their role was fighting to gain Crimea in the first place. Now, clearly also Putin inherited power at a time when Russia seemed to be moving more towards democracy. He's been very definitely moving it back towards autocracy, wanting to deter NATO expansion, stay in power, and of course ease away from democracy back to autocracy. And controlling the media is a way of doing that. In terms of his strategy, though, he had fought wars in Chechnya and Georgia relatively successfully. He invaded Crimea virtually bloodlessly and didn't have any impact from it. So bluntly, on the 24th of February, he thought he'd try the same with Ukraine. Now, whilst to the West, it should have been evident that plan wouldn't work, in something like Putin, who is dominant, who tells truth to power, who actually challenges the politician, the man at the top, as to what the implications might be. And evidently, if Ukraine was happy to be liberated, as Putin believed, Russia would have walked in. Instead, plan A for the Russians, which was just a walk in, clearly failed. Plan B to fight their way into Kyiv and actually take the leadership failed. So they went on to plan C, which was the military plan. Russia had invested a lot of time and money in the Donbass over the previous 10 years, and therefore gradually develop a war of attrition against the Ukrainian forces. The other part of the plan was also to make sure that Crimea, it's all about preserving Crimea and access to Crimea. Crimea was cut off the electricity grid from Ukraine after the invasion, which was why the Russians made a target of taking Zaporizhzhia, the nuclear power plant, but also Crimea relies on fresh water, of which Kherson, the city of Kherson, controls access to that water, which is one of the reasons I think that Putin ended up targeting that as well. And of course, since then, Russia's momentum has gradually stalled. They had the initiative. They were gradually, despite heroic Ukrainian defense, Ukrainians have gradually been ceding ground. But of course, steadily, the West's weapons have been coming in. Russian troops, their frailties have been demonstrated from their conscript army and largely looked as if they'd stalled. And for the first time now, we're seeing Ukrainian fightbacks, counterattacks. It's too early to say this is decisive, but there is a window before the winter arrives, which won't stop the fighting, but will make it a lot more difficult to do maneuver warfare. Let's have another look at a couple of other areas that I think might be interesting for questioning. Oops, sorry. So one of which is sanctions. I get asked a lot about the impact of sanctions. In many ways, the sanctions are hurting the Russian people more than they're hurting the Russian leadership. Putin is making more money from oil and gas exports than he's ever made before. The cost of taking this stuff out of the ground hasn't changed a great deal, but the cost on the market is phenomenal. And just because we and the West are going to wean ourselves off Russian oil, as the graphic shows, there's quite a lot of nations that are dependent and supporters of Russia. So I don't think there'll be any great outlet, any great issue for them continuing to sell oil and gas. In many ways, the pain is worse for the West than it is the East. The challenge, I think, though, is we tend to look in the West at short-term pain, whereas in the longer term, it's very much more uncertain. The West will wean itself off Russian oil, and more importantly, our exports of technology to Russia have dried up, which is already making life extremely difficult for them. So whilst they should be a very wealthy nation, in reality, they're not, and it'll be interesting to see how that prevails in the longer term. If we look at just a couple of other areas, in Russian mistakes along the way, I think strategically, they've underestimated the Ukrainian resistance, willingness to fight, which was a clear intelligence failure, bluntly. They should have seen that, but also overlooked the impact of the West's response. But to be fair, I think even commentators are surprised about how unified the West has been, given that we did virtually nothing when Russia went into Crimea. I think the other thing that Russia did was overestimate its own forces. On the back of the Second Chechen War, the Georgian campaign in Crimea and Syria, but none of those campaigns were against a very credible, technologically advanced nation. And whereas in Ukraine, you've got fellow Slavs who are used to hardship, who fought heroically and are gradually getting hold of Western weapons and exposing the frailties of the conscript army that the Russians had. Another area of weakness, I think, or mistakes, the harm to Russia's economy. Russia's putting a brave face on it at the moment, but almost certainly, as discussed, this will get worse, not better for Russia. Russia was also trying to delay or defer NATO expansion. That's clearly going to happen. And also NATO's cohesion has been reinforced. So it's very difficult to see how this is a success for Russia. And the final mistake, I think, is exposes the frailties of an autocratic system where one person is omnipotent and makes all the decisions and doesn't have a discussion. There's lots of examples in history where you do need a collection of views to prevail on the battlefield, and having an autocratic leader doesn't provide you with that. I think I'm going to just quickly canter onto the nuclear question, because again, I get asked a lot about, is Putin going to use his nuclear weapons? I come from a generation where we talked about nuclear weapons as being mutually assured destruction, because you need them to prevent other people using them, but you never ever want to use them in reality. Again, I think the West's doctrine had therefore been, we have to have them, but we'll never use them. What we'd never really envisaged was countries like Russia threatening other nations from getting involved by threatening them with a nuclear threat, meanwhile going and attacking another country that wasn't nuclear armed. And that wasn't really a contingency that I think NATO or the nuclear powers had thought through. And I think it'll be really interesting now to see how our nuclear strategy develops, particularly how those countries who don't have nuclear weapons see the benefits or otherwise of nuclear weapons. And finally, next steps. I think in terms of the Ukraine conflict, in a way, there's been a clash of ideologies, liberal democracy versus autocratic capitalism. It's been around for quite a while, but we have in the West still done business with people who we don't trust or we don't believe in their way of life, but we've still made ourselves dependent on them. There is a growing view now that the future will be a lot more careful about who we do business with. And that the danger is that creates a new Cold War, if you like, with the China-Russia axis and the West's axis. Will that be more dangerous? I don't know. I don't think they'll threaten each other, but it seems to me that China and Russia need the West as much, if not more, than the West needs China and Russia. So it'll be really interesting to see how trade and military tensions, particularly around Taiwan, how that develops. So in summary, I think I won't repeat myself, but one of the questions is, was this inevitable? But also, is Putin mad? Very definitely, I think if you look at it through Russia's lens, there is a degree of inevitability, and the West might have handled this better. And I don't think Putin's mad at all. I think the United States, the world superpower, is focused on China, not Russia, and potentially left a window open for President Putin to act. Democracy has been spreading, and that is seen as a threat to some, particularly in the world of the internet. And whilst this might have been avoidable, this conflict, it's very difficult to say in hindsight what the West could have done differently. But whilst tactically Russia has taken ground, whilst tactically Russia is not finished yet, from a strategic perspective, NATO has become stronger. NATO will grow. Russian greatness will have been impacted adversely by this. Russian prosperity in the near term will benefit, in the longer term will not. And Russia's influence on the global stage will undoubtedly be dented. So with that, I appreciate that's been a really swift canter through. As I say, I reiterate, I'm not the oracle. I very much look forward to questions and try and work my way through some of your perspectives on this. Thank you.
So, perfect. Thank you in advance for your speech. It was very direct. So I collected some questions in advance, but I will start with the first one. It is like, at this point, is Macron European army possible? And what is Europe's reaction to a separate continental army not connected to the US?
Yeah, this is a great question. We could spend hours on this. I think I would probably say what Russia's invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated is that most countries, apart from America and maybe one or two others, most countries could not effectively defend themselves against Russia or a similar threat. And therefore, whilst it's important to have national military capability, what this Russian invasion has shown is the importance of alliances, importance of having friends who can come to your aid if needed and act as a credible deterrence, because no military wants to actually fight. And the whole purpose when I was in the military was to be as credible and effective as you can be, because then you deter people from having a go. They don't fancy their chances. The risks outweigh the benefits. So whether those alliances are NATO, whether those alliances are a European army, whether those alliances are bilateral, trilateral, I think that remains to be seen. I think the danger of reinventing a European army is that different nations will feel different threats, different levels of fear, risk, etc. But I do think one thing that has to be done more effectively is interoperability. So all the countries of the world that have a similar disposition would be keen on operating together. At the moment, it's quite difficult for military forces to operate effectively together. And I'll give you an example. When I was flying military jets, they're quite expensive to fly, and you can't put yourself or the aircraft at risk very easily doing high-end operational training. So you do a lot of your training in a simulator, very high-tech simulator, and I've died many times in a simulator trying to make sure I didn't have to do that for real. But linking those simulators up, both nationally and across all three services, and then internationally, has been an ambition for years, but is still not done. And if we are, as an international community, going to develop a credible military capability, training is a vital part of it. We must break ourselves away from thinking that we count tanks, ships, and aircraft as military capability. You know, Russia and China every year have big military parades where they showcase all of their equipment. And yet, as soon as it comes to operating that for real, grave shortcomings that it hasn't worked, because equipment doesn't equal capability. Equipment plus training, plus logistics, plus everything else needs to be packaged together. And I think we need to train better together, because training is one of the key ingredients. So in answer to the question, I wouldn't want to get drawn into the benefits of European versus NATO versus others. But I do absolutely believe the alliances will be far more important in the future. But it isn't just alliances, it's the ability to train together and fight together. And that means exploiting technology, which we don't do effectively today.
Connected to this question, it's would the US do a better job than a RAF in the same situation?
What situation are we talking about here? Are we saying, I don't know the context of that question. Perhaps if I just try answer what I think the question is. So the United States Air Force is the most powerful air force in the world. It has a range of capabilities, including stealth, hypersonics, and a range of weapons and capability matched by nobody else in the world. I was privileged enough to fight alongside the Americans and to do big exercises like Red Flag, which is their sort of Top Gun, if you like, of training, and very demanding, adrenaline flowing, and it makes you realize just how seriously the Americans take defense and military capability. So on that side, the Americans are dominant. My one caveat would be is that the UK, and I think it's true of a number of countries, because we've never had enough money to do everything, we have to choose and be selective about what capabilities we can cover off and then make do. We have to innovate. We have to operate with a lot of discretion. We have to make sure that we try new things, and we are much more dynamic and innovative as a result. And therefore, you will find that whilst the Americans, for example, have got every golf club in their golf bag plus a few spares when it comes to military capability, the Brits can only afford 3 golf clubs. And so we have a 5-iron in that golf club, but we are able to use the 5-iron to hit 100 yards or 200 yards. And we become good at using an iron, not the way it was designed to, but to create the right effect. And I think that's something which a lot of countries, particularly the UK, we've been involved in a lot of combat operations over the last 100 years, the life of the Air Force, 104 years now. So whilst I would not claim to match the Royal Air Force, to match the United States Air Force in terms of equipment, when it comes to our professionalism, our operational capability, and our credibility, it's a lot closer.
Perfect. So next question by Web Union, which is our YouTube map analysis, one of our group. Do you think that Europe will bend to the pressure over the gas crisis, or do you think that they will double down on Russia? And if you think that will double down, how far do you believe that they were willing to go?
Yeah, this is one of the questions of our time, isn't it? It's a really difficult question. I mean, people have asked me all sorts of questions like this, one of which is, at what point does the cost of living crisis outweigh continuing to support Ukraine? Unfortunately, that's an interesting question, but in a way it's the wrong question. The real question is that Europe, Ukraine, the United States didn't start this war. This was President Putin invaded Ukraine, and until he declares it over, until either he clears out of Ukraine or stops fighting and tries to sue for peace, none of us can control what happens next. And I think the lessons of history are that however uncomfortable gas prices, oil prices being very high is, if President Putin, if Russia succeeds in invading Ukraine, a sovereign nation, and basically feels no pain for that, where will it stop? Which country will be next? And if you study your history, study Putin's ambitions, the former spread of the Soviet Union, there are a lot of other countries that Putin would seek to invade and to take back under his wing. So I think this is I don't want to get alarmist, but it feels to me like an existential threat, a massive threat to our very way of life. And if the small price we're paying is very high costs of energy, then actually we're paying the price for our own mistakes. It's easy to say in hindsight, I'm not being judgmental, but we really shouldn't have been making ourselves dependent on our potential enemies' gas and oil supplies, which we did. In terms of the question about should Europe make a particular, I think that's a really interesting question because, for example, the United Kingdom, because we had North Sea oil, we are less dependent on Russian oil and gas, but we're still paying very high prices. Germany, for example, with its massive industrial base and a much higher dependency on Russian gas and oil, it's a very different conversation for Germany than it is for the United Kingdom. And I think it's very difficult to put a one size fits all. But my honest answer is that although people might want to couch this as a discussion, do we continue to support Ukraine or do we try and solve the cost of living crisis? I don't think that's a choice. I think the fact is that if the West is to deal with this outrageous invasion of a country and to stop this happening again, to send a clear message to anybody who thinks that invading a sovereign country is acceptable, then if the Western world, if the price we pay is high energy bills for a year or two, before we inevitably, all of us, go much more to green energy, sustainable energy, etc. I think the President Zelensky's wife captured it beautifully when she said, "You may be counting the pennies, but we're counting it in bodies." And I think we have to remember that it's not an easy choice. And in fact, I don't think it's a choice we can make.
Okay, I agree with you. Like this question, it's from before the speech. So about the famous not 1 inch eastward assurance that NATO expansion will be in the meeting of James Baker on February 9, 1990. Was this an error, to, let's say, make a promise and after the collapse of SSSR, of the Soviet Union, NATO started to go east?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating one. President Gorbachev, his memory has changed a little bit over the years about what actually happened here. And I wasn't there, so it's impossible for me to say. Was it evident from history that the Russians were left with a clear impression that NATO had no intention of expanding to the east? I think that's true. I think for many years, NATO was seen as a defensive organization to counter the threat of the former Soviet Union. And therefore, the collapse of the Soviet Union, in a way, you've taken away the very reason for NATO to exist. So I can imagine that politicians would have said at the time, why would it expand further east? I do think it's an unfortunate, I can't commentate because I wasn't there, but it does seem as if the Russians were left with a clear impression that NATO would not expand. I think the language here is important as well, though, because Russia had said to Ukraine in 1991, we will absolutely, we will respect your boundaries, your borders. We will absolutely, there will be no threat to you if you give up nuclear weapons, and signed to that effect. There's no ambiguity there. That was absolutely clear. And yet, funny old thing, a few years later, Putin decides to ignore that and just walk into Ukraine. And if Ukraine still had nuclear weapons, would Russia have done that? So I do think we've got to be quite careful about being selective. Do I think it's unfortunate that Russia was left with that impression? But in 1991, when that happened, do I think it's reasonable that Russia would have thought, and America would have thought, that NATO had no reason to expand? but none of us can predict the future. And who would have predicted that Putin would have invaded a sovereign nation? So as I alluded to in my short piece, I think it's unfortunate. And I think if you were Putin, you would use that as one of the elements of justification for why you feel paranoid about the West's expansion. But I don't think that justifies any country is entitled to defend itself. It's one of the major obligations of any government. And if the only way to do that is to join a club, is to form alliances, then I'm afraid, you only do that in response to threats. And Putin invading Ukraine is a pretty big threat.
It's very interesting. I want to show you this. I made, let's say, one stream. It was about the Ukrainian referendum in 1991. It was very interesting because the majority in all oblasts was agreeing the independent state, also in Donbass. If you see 83%, only in Crimea was 54 or 57, but over 50%. And the interesting thing is that still at that time, 30 years ago, like the Russians were expressing their position that Sevastopol, Crimea, and Donbass will be, let's say, cut from the, let's say, Ukrainian independent state after the independence. So it's nothing, let's say, new in the Russian point of view. Okay, another question about the Kherson counteroffensive. As I saw in your, let's say, speech in Sky News, you said that for have success, you need let's say, a quantity of resource that is in abundance or surprise, and we don't have neither one or the other, or we don't know about the quantity of materials. So why the Kherson Oblast is so important for both parts, and what could be the real goal of the offensive?
Yeah, I'll try and do that in two parts then. So why is Kherson important for both parties? I covered why I think it's important for Russia earlier. It's important because Crimea needs electricity, and it's been cut off from the grid for the last 8 years. And therefore, Zaporizhzhia, just to the northeast of Kherson, is important. And fresh water coming from Ukraine is from Kherson. It's important. It's also important because if the Russians seek to take back its former territory, it would want to take the whole of the north coast of the Black Sea, and that would include Odessa. And Kherson is a very important stepping stone for Russia en route to Odessa, which is about 200 kilometers further west. So for that reason, it's very important for Russia. If you look at it from a President Zelensky's perspective, clearly he wants to protect Odessa. And also he wants to start to seize the initiative. So for those reasons, I think it's important for both sides. The question, though, is when the media was told that this counteroffensive was underway, there were quick question marks in my head, because military operations, you generally want to seize the initiative and you want to have an element of surprise. So you don't tell everybody what you're going to do. If you tell everybody what they're going to do, they can react to it. So President Zelensky would have known that. So the real question is, why announce it? And I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that. One of which is because despite heroic Ukrainian defense, Russia has been winning the Battle of the Donbass. It's been slow, it's been expensive, it's been attritional, it's been devastating, but Russia is winning the Battle of the Donbass. And by forcing Russia to bring forces away from the Donbass and bring them down to reinforce its position at Kherson, would reduce the Russians' potential to continue to fight in the Donbass. And whilst fighting has continued there since the announcement of the counterattack, the amount of ground taken is negligible. And it seems more likely that everybody's just firing at each other, trying to keep their heads down. In terms of Kherson, I think there is a really interesting paradox here, because without a map, but in essence, the river, the Dnieper River that runs to the eastern side of Kherson, used to have 3 big bridges, which is the resupply bridges for the Russians. So the Ukrainians have taken those bridges out. They're using the Western weapons, which provide greater range and greater accuracy, to now strike at the Russian resupply of equipment, ammunition, and people. They're isolating the forces that are within Kherson. Even though there are 20, 30,000 Russian soldiers, they're isolating them from their support, which would have a grave impact on their morale, particularly conscript soldiers. And the big dichotomy here is that, again, we were expecting, as the military analyst, for Ukraine to try and fight back and take Kherson. Incredibly difficult operation, hand-to-hand fighting around every street corner, really difficult. What the Russians were doing when they were doing it in reverse, they just literally mortared and artillery fire, leveled the city and walk in. Ukraine doesn't want to do that to Kherson. So I think what's been fascinating is that they are isolating the Russian troops, cutting them off from the resupply, and gradually make it such that the Russians face no choice but to withdraw rather than stay and fight. And the other big difference, which I think is the reason why President Zelensky has announced it, is that unlike in the Donbass, where there's a lot of sympathizers to Russia across the Donbass, there are significantly fewer with Russian sympathies across in Kherson. There's been a lot of public displays of resistance. There's been a lot of murders of Russian soldiers. If President Zelensky can capture the spirit of that resistance, harness it, and use that to help their soldiers take the city, target where the Russians are, surgical strikes, erode their morale, then over time, it's quite possible that the Russians will feel obliged to move out. So in answer to the question, why is it important? I think it's important for geographic reasons, but the reason that the counterattack has been focused there, I think, is twofold. One of which is to take Russian forces and move them away from the Donbass. And secondly, is to rouse the resistance, to play the long game, to gradually squeeze Russia and get them to feel obliged to move out. But this is a sensitive military operation. I am not part of the Ukrainian military. I'm simply trying to create some sense out of the details I've been fed.
If I can, Sean, this is another question connected to your answer. There are reports that Ukraine has started another counterattack in Izium. Why do you think that they have decided to split their forces instead of focusing to Kherson?
Well, I think it links to the first point, really, is that if you can force Russia to take your forces from the Donbass and have to move across to Kherson, it's not just the forces, it's all their logistics support and everything. It's a big operation to get them all over there. If actually that was a ruse, if that was a deception plan, because actually you really wanted to mount an attack in the Donbass and start to liberate the Donbass, the way you do that is you try and create the illusion that you're going to be fighting somewhere else, get the Russian soldiers to move out, and now go and attack. So that's one reason. And the second one is, I think you've got a small window of opportunity before the winter arrives, probably 8 weeks or so. And as I've said before, I don't think that's going to stop the fighting. But when the rains start to come down, using heavy military equipment off-road is going to be a lot more difficult. That makes military operations a lot more predictable and a lot more vulnerable to technology, to precision strike from a. So it looks likely that once we get into those periods that the war will stagnate or stall. And before then, President Zelensky desperately needs some good news. The Ukrainians have withstood over 6 months of war. They've gradually been ceding ground. They've been taking immense casualties. There's not much good news coming out. And I think President Zelensky is determined to try to end this fighting season with some successes to show that Ukraine is seizing the initiative. It's not all going Russia's way, that they are able to take some ground. And I think that's going to be really important for them for the long term.
I have another question for you, Sean, from our team map analyst Jana New Wordecon. Question for Sean. Is there any weapon supplied to Ukraine that are a game changer example? There is much talk about ATGM and counter battle radar, but Russia has also his technology.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the reality is that so Ukraine, being a former Soviet Union state, has got Russian equipment, but an older generation of Russian equipment. So when it comes to a straight fight, not only does Russia have more people, it has better equipment, and it has technology. It has precision-guided munitions. It has long-range artillery. It has all of these things, which Ukrainians did not have. What's become very evident as the war has continued is that whilst the Russians do have precision weapons, they don't have many of them. And that is a classic example of where corruption has damaged the Russian military, because generally speaking, a precision weapon costs 10 times as much as a non-precision weapon. So it costs a lot more to buy this stuff. And if you're facing corruption, you don't buy quite as many. The irony is that you need significantly fewer precision weapons than you do dumb weapons. An example of that is in the Second World War, because the average miss distance for a bomb from an aircraft was 4 miles. So the reason they had 1,000 bomber raids with each of those bombers carrying 20 bombs was because even then you couldn't guarantee to hit the target. So you leveled areas of trying to attack one target. These days, with precision, one bomb can take out the target within 4 feet, not 4 miles. And as a result, you only need one bomb to take out specific targets. Now, Russia has that technology, but has not got it in the quantities that it needs for this operation. So it's resorted back to attritional carpet bombing, using its artillery as it goes. Because Ukraine didn't have precision weapons, it could simply fight that same war of attrition, but it had fewer artillery. So, for example, I think they were matched 10-1, so 10 Russian artillery to 1 Ukrainian. It can't possibly win that battle. Now that the West has provided precision weapons, and we can get into specifics if you like, but the reality is it's weapons like anti-tank weapons, it's weapons like HIMARS, it's weapons that can travel more than the Russian artillery, but also can hit targets rather than just being an area target. That has proven remarkably effective because the Russians' conscript army have moved all their artillery forward. So if a Ukrainian artillery can go 18 miles, then you put your store at 25 miles away, knowing it's safe from the Ukrainians' attack. If you've now got a Western weapon that can not only fire 50 miles, but can fire with precision, your artillery stockpile is no longer safe. Excuse me. And that is where the game-changing technology is happening. It's Western weapons that are being used now to target the rear echelons of the Russian support, the tanks, the ammunition, the food, the supplies, the reinforcements, and that's isolating the Russian position. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as more Western technology flows in. Unfortunately, it's one thing giving somebody HIMARS, it's quite another thing that they need to be trained how to use it, because an old artillery piece, you thrust the shell in, fire it, move the barrel a bit, do the same again. If you've actually got a radar on the side of that machine that can see where the incoming round is coming from, can predict where the target of the gun is, align the gun's barrel and fire an accurate shell back, that is a game changer, because the Russians were firing 20,000 rounds a day, but not targeting, just largely dumb artillery. If every time now one artillery shell gets fired, the Ukrainians can target that specific piece and send a very accurate artillery piece to take it out, all of a sudden the conscript army are not going to be happy about spending all day firing rounds out of their artillery. So I think we are seeing some really interesting game-changing use of technology with the Western supply of weapons.
Shana, another interesting question. If you have any recommendation on books or read about military strategy theory?
Well, that's a good question. I don't really. I think what's lovely is if you search for Sun Tzu, who was hundreds of years, thousands of years ago, a great warrior leader. There's a very short book about the principles of war by Sun Tzu, and if you read those, they endure today, because they are about attack your enemy where he is weak, not where he is strong. It is all some really simple things which stand the test of time. I also think that war, certainly my experience of war, is that the danger is we are seduced by tactics. We want to fight what's in front of us rather than actually the strategy that's needed to win the war. Every now and again, you need to give a bit of ground here in order to gain a bit of ground over there. And sometimes that compromise is very uncomfortable when people are fighting for their lives, what they're facing ahead of them. And I think the operational art, as it's known, is not just about, let's go back hundreds of years where one army would meet another army preordained on a battlefield, would charge at each other, and the last man standing would win. There was lots of honor, lots of pride, but bluntly, it was horribly attritional. Then they developed bows and arrows. So now you could kill people before they could attack you. And there were a whole load of bowmen, killing lots of people. Then they invented guns. Now you could fire each other. You didn't actually have to close to battle. Then you had your enemy looking at you from balloons, and they could see where you were, so they could target you. So then the enemy would put up an aircraft to shoot down the balloon to stop you looking at them. Then the aircraft would have a go at each other. Warfare is constantly evolving in terms of tactics, but the strategy of war actually hasn't changed a great deal. And Sun Tzu is a good starting point.
Perfect. So, next question. Okay, it was very specific, but it was still before Maidan. Can you clarify why Yanukovych chose closer tie with Russia over European Union, and what deal the European Union was offering?
Right, chose closer ties with Russia over EU. Well, I'm not an expert on this question. If we're talking about the history of Ukraine, there's an interesting in the post-fall of the Soviet Union, Russia imposed a puppet regime in Ukraine. And in a way, we're seeing a similar sort of dynamic in Belarus. I think part of Ukraine's struggle over the last 30 years has been, you don't overnight suddenly turn from an authoritarian regime to democracy. I bumped into a couple of Ukrainians during the last 6 months who've been listening to coverage that we've been using Sky News or whatever. And they were quick to point out that don't paint the Ukrainians as the good guys here. We're fellow Slavs. We've had to survive. We've had very difficult history. We have corruption. We have to survive. We have to steal. We have to do whatever is required. Over the years, since we have got our independence, the reason we had so many difficulties for the first few years was that the history of the Soviet Union meant we weren't motivated, incentivized to look to the markets to create opportunity. And the one thing Ukraine did in the last 10 years was to gradually grow its own prosperity. But could it join the EU tomorrow? No. Could it join NATO tomorrow? No. There are still loads of reasons why the country would not yet meet the entry criteria in terms of rules, regulations, corruption, etc. And that's not to be dismissive of Ukraine. It's just that from its background, it has a very interesting history. And I think particularly it's a very complicated landscape, but fellow Slavs in Russia and Ukraine. The reason the Donbass is fascinating is because there are a lot of Slavs there, some of which would naturally be sympathetic to Russia, some of which would naturally be sympathetic to Ukraine. And just because there was an arbitrary line that marked the edge of Ukraine and start of Russia doesn't necessarily mean everybody one side is massively supportive of Ukraine and everybody the other side is massively supportive of Russia. So I think it's a very complex history in that part of the world. I wouldn't want to get into specifics about individuals. Suffice to say that Ukraine is on a journey, and the very fight it's having now for its independence, whilst horrible, I am convinced will be a very proud part of their history once the battles are over and once Ukraine enjoys its full independence.
This is like also Jan that is like adding to your answer. My understanding of Yanukovych trade debacle is that Russia offered a no string attached bailout, and the European Union had many string attached, so Russian deal was better. But so I think that also there was let's say a contraposition between the newly made Eurasiatican communities and the European Union. So the Eurasiatic Union was only Belarus, Central Asia, and Russia. And Ukraine had to choose, and Yanukovych chose with Russia, and this started when Maidan and whatever. But other questions, I will put the last 2-3 questions, so we will stay in the hour. What do you think about Boris Johnson blowing up the peace negotiation back in March? The action by the West must also be acknowledgement in the conflict, going back to at least 2014 to today.
Sorry, Boris Johnson blowing up the peace negotiations? I'm not aware of how he did that.
No, there is like rumors that when there was the peace negotiation in March, like there was UK that was against peace negotiation between the two parts.
Okay, I don't want to get involved in conjecture. I am aware that in the early part of this war, President Zelensky was under a lot of pressure from some nations to come to a peace accord with Russia, to give up ground, to give up Crimea, and to give up the Donbass. And I know at the time, several European leaders had a chat to President Zelensky, who made it very clear that the future of Ukraine lay in Ukraine's hands, not in the West's hands, and that President Zelensky would not even consider a peace negotiation without Russia withdrawing its forces from Crimea and from the Donbass. That is my understanding of President Zelensky's position. And certainly our Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, was a very, very keen supporter of Ukraine, a keen supporter of President Zelensky, a keen supporter of whatever President Zelensky wanted to do, whether it was to fight or whether it was to give up. He was a supporter of that, whichever way it fell. But he absolutely, I do remember him being very vocal at making sure that the international community did not apply pressure to President Zelensky to agree any form of peace deal for their own benefit, when ultimately this was a Ukrainian decision to make.
Another question that it's, I think, not complete, but is Russia cut off when Ukraine did not take out rail bridges?
I presume they're talking about Kherson here.
Yes.
The interesting thing about rail bridges is what you can and cannot move on railways. And I think one of the things that has been very interesting about, from a military perspective, if you do what Russia did, which is scorched earth, you blow up everything. When you now take control of, for example, Mariupol, you take control of something that's completely destroyed, and you've got to rebuild it from scratch, and that's a nightmare. President Zelensky and the Ukrainian forces will almost certainly believe that they can retake Kherson, and they will not want to destroy it. They will want to make sure that they can get it back functioning as soon as possible afterwards. And therefore, destroying all of the infrastructure is probably not in their best interest. What they will want to do is to make sure that they can take out. So, for example, taking out the railway bridge is one way of stopping the railways running. Another way of doing it is to cut the electricity off from that particular part of the railway grid. Another part is to target particular, a railway. A train on a railway is particularly vulnerable because it can't steer off the railway. It's very predictable where it's going, and therefore presents a very juicy target for accurate Western weapons. So the honest answer is, obviously, I'm not involved in the tactics of the war, but I do understand why you would want to, unlike the Russians that are just literally leveling everything in front of them, why the Ukrainians would want to preserve as much infrastructure as possible.
Okay, the last two questions. One that was previously sent, but I didn't see. Could be more countries with their side to the Russian Chinese, like India or some African countries. But if I can put another to this question, that I put it before, but I forget to. It was like the news of the day that this one, okay, that Moscow by the US intelligence is trying to buying weapons not from China but from North Korea. Do you think that this alliance between China and Russia, it's so rocky as they said in the world shows and whatever, or no?
I think there's been a lot of discussion.
Sean, only to put this one to the public. This is like, for example, the gas sent to Europe and the gas sent to China. So it's only to understand the amount of the trade between the two parts. And another thing that is interesting, it's in the trade balance. How much is China important for Russia? It's the first trader, and how much Russia it's important for China? It's the 11th. So it's not. It's asymmetrical.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions in there. I think if I go to the military part first, there was a lot of conjecture that the Russians were running out of artillery shells because they were using 20,000 a day. My understanding is they have millions of artillery shells. There's no shortage of artillery shells. They may not all be in the right place. And when you use up 20,000 a day, these things weigh 50 kilograms a time. That's a big weight of ordnance you've got to move around. And as soon as you move them around, they become vulnerable. And the Western weapons have provided accuracy and surgical strike against the resupply lines. I think where Russia has hurt is in its smart munitions, in its ability to have surgical, high precision, targeted weapons. And it realizes that the West is providing those apace to Ukraine, and Russia is at a disadvantage. Therefore, how does it get hold of those weapons? Does it get them from China? China, I think, at least presentationally, is trying very hard not to swing in completely behind Russia, because it's watching to see, as the dust settles, Russia may be doing quite well at times in the conflict, but if its global influence has diminished as a result of this, China, a lot of China's wealth comes from its exports. And if the world was to, if America and the West was to decide that we were no longer going to have Chinese exports, that would be devastating for the Chinese economy. And unlike Russia, which is selling oil and gas, most of the exports from China are things that we can source ourselves. It's just cheaper coming from China. So I don't think we would suffer the same way at all if we had to impose the sanctions on China. So I think China's trying to be quite careful. Tellingly, when you then start sourcing weapons from countries like North Korea, who bluntly are not very technologically advanced, Yes, they've got some rocket programs and stuff like that, but it's all a big show of force behind the scenes. Certainly when I was in the military, and I understand since, that they are some way behind the West in terms of technology. And it's one thing showing off when you're doing a launch of a rocket to try to scare the international community. It's quite another whether you supply expensive weapons and then they work or not on the battlefield. So I do think it exposes Russia it needs soldiers. So it's trying to recruit soldiers from all over the place. It's trying to incentivize its own people. It's lost loads of soldiers. Even if it manages to get more, they are conscripts, they're untrained, and a battlefield is not the place to learn how to fight a war. Secondly, it also needs weapons. It has done weapons, but as this war is showing, that medieval style of warfare is not effective when you're up against a 21st century adversary, and they are desperately keen to try and solve that as well. But I think all of that just demonstrates this war is not going the way that Russia had thought it would, but it'll be really interesting to see how the next chapter plays out.
Okay, like the last question to close, and then if there is anybody else that want to put any question, just put in the comments. We will talk in the next streams. Please subscribe to the channel. So only to showing to you this map that was, let's say, the Russian propaganda pre-February 24. So we saw that the real, let's say, goal was this one, not Donbass, Crimea, and no. So this is it's Russian source. It's not from West. So if we have like to finish with this speech, like what could be the outlook of that? Of the actual war in Ukraine, like what could be a deal scenario between Ukraine and Russia? What and who can give each part for the peace, in your opinion?
Yeah, again, this is a question I've been asked a fair amount. How does this war come to an end? And the honest answer is, let's use language first. Be careful about language. People ask about winning or losing. I'm a military officer. I've been to the funerals of a lot of my friends over the years. Nobody wins in war. There are only losers. The military fight. The politicians have to come to compromises to end the war. And for those compromises to be reached, both the leaders, both President Zelensky and President Putin, have to believe that either they can't go any further or that they've achieved everything they want to achieve. Now, at the moment, President Zelensky has been really clear that he genuinely believes, and I think Ukrainians believe, that the Russian onslaught, they will sweep Russia out of Ukraine. That's what I believe Ukrainian believes. And therefore, at the moment, it's very difficult to see how they would accept anything other than a complete Russian withdrawal. From President Putin's perspective, I think most analysts believe that he wanted the whole of Ukraine. If not the whole of Ukraine, then certainly the whole of the Baltic coast, Black Sea coast, and as you've drawn, a fairly substantial part of Ukraine. That seems very unlikely that that's going to be achievable. The Russians have made progress in the last 6 months, but gradually they've, at a huge cost to their military, at huge cost to the infrastructure. And now that Western weapons are flowing in, it's very difficult to see how Russia will be able to achieve that objective. So the challenge, therefore, is, so what would be the catalyst for concluding the war? And I think from a military perspective, if any solution, any conclusion, any peace that gives Russia land is a success for Russia, and whether it's in 1 month, in 1 year, in 10 years, or in 20 years' time, we'll be facing exactly the same problem again, because Russia will learn from its mistakes. Its military will get stronger. It will plan more effectively. And the next time it does this, it will be far more effective. So it's very difficult to see how any peace where Russia has gained ground is tenable. But by contrast, I also think I can't see a circumstance where Crimea and Sevastopol is returned to Ukrainian hands. It's been fought over for centuries. There are very well established defensive lines. And now, what do I know? But it's almost impossible for me to see how Crimea would be returned to Ukrainian hands. So unfortunately, not a satisfactory answer. I think we've got a lot of fighting still to come. And I think that this will be part of whatever the solution, whenever it does stop. You know, my own personal view is that there'll be areas of the Donbass which, because of Russian sympathy, will be very difficult for Ukraine to get back. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's part of the Donbass which the Ukrainians ultimately give up. I think they'd be very reluctant to give up Mariupol, Kherson, Zaporizhia, even Crimea. But again, I say it's difficult, and therefore they will do counterattacks to try to liberate it. And hopefully they will be able to get the Russian conscript army on the run. And that will be a very bloody nose for President Putin. But I don't have a great crystal ball, so I'm afraid I can't be more specific.
So perfect. I think that you answered perfectly to all the questions. I received a lot of others, but there is no time anymore. So for anybody that want to make other question, we will have also tomorrow 2 other speeches. So we will see tomorrow. And please subscribe to the channel, put the like on the video, and we hope that you liked our content. And thanks, Sean, for your speech, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your patience and for listening.
Thank you all. Ciao, ciao.